Part 8. Lynmouth to Coombe Martin. Around 7:30 in the morning, the taxi driver dropped me off just before the town bridge, and I set off to try and find somewhere to get a spot of breakfast. When it comes to finding somewhere open before 9 a.m, small country towns always keep you guessing. Sometimes they'll have a little corner shop or a garage where you can pick up a sandwich and a soft drink, if not a local bakery or a hole-in-the-wall cafe full of tradesmen feasting on bacon butties. Other times the town will be completely dead until past 10 a.m. After taking a few minutes to wander up and down the flag-lined quayside, it soon became clear that Linmoth was one of the latter, at least today. Luckily though, I managed to find a free water refill point in a small community garden next to the Linmoth Flood Memorial Hall. So, I set up my stove on one of the garden walls and cooked up my last sachet of instant porridge. Given that Linmoth marks the intersection of at least 4 different trails, the locals must be used to hikers bumbling about in the mornings, as the 2 locals who gave me a nod on their way past didn't take any umbrage at my impromptu picnic. I've always found there's something quite satisfying about having breakfast outside. Maybe it's because the weather in the UK generally isn't that conducive to al fresco dining, but it's always felt vaguely luxurious even if all you're having is a packet of Quakers. Either way, it put me in a good mood, so after tidying up, repacking and making sure I hadn't left any rubbish behind, I walked past the Rising Sun pub and took a left at the Rhenish Tower. Given the open fire basket attached to the roof, I initially thought that the Rhenish must have been some sort of defensive structure built to protect the harbour back in the Elizabethan era, but as it turns out, this isn't the case. In fact, it was built back in the 1830s and served as both a navigational aid for merchant ships and a bathhouse for visitors who wanted to bathe in the local seawater without braving the tides and the waves. Personally, I can see the appeal of taking a bath in a small castle topped with an open fire. All you'd need to do is throw in a plate of grapes and a horn of ale, and it could all get very Game of Thrones quite quickly. Unfortunately though, it stopped providing this service a while back, so I left it behind and headed towards the wireframe sculpture known as the Walker. This statue of an old-school rambler complete with flat cap and walking stick marks the meeting point of 4 different hiking trails: the Coleridge Way, the Two Moors Way, the SWCP and the Tarka Trail. And custom dictates that you should shake the walker's outstretched hand for luck as you pass him. To tell you the truth, I honestly can't remember whether I did or I didn't, but I had pretty good luck throughout the rest of my journey, so if I didn't, then I certainly should have done. Once the walker was behind me, I headed up a steep switchback path that followed the Lynmouth-Linton Cliff Railway. Built in the late 19th century, this railway was originally designed to ferry goods and passengers from the docks at Lynmouth up the steep cliffs to its twin village of Linton. Before it was installed, the locals had used a combination of pack animals and horse-drawn carriages to achieve this, and honestly, after doing the walk with 13 kilos on my back, I can understand why those poor creatures had such a short working life. By the time I was about halfway up, my face had turned a spectacular shade of purple, and I was pretty much convinced that I'd be leaving my breakfast on the floor. Truthfully, had I had the option, I may have cheated and taken the railway, but given that it wasn't open until later that day, I was spared the temptation. It was a good thing too. Despite being incredibly steep, the walk up was absolutely gorgeous. Not only did I get a close-up look at the workings of the railway itself, but I also got a panoramic view of the valley below, and even though the weather was slightly greyish, it still took my breath away. Besides, it was the only way to get up to the Valley of the Rocks. I can't remember where I read this, but while I was doing my research in advance of the hike, I remember coming across a story about how the Valley of the Rocks came into being. According to this tale, the devil challenged the Archangel Gabriel to a duel, and they picked this particular stretch of coastline to fight on. As you'd imagine, the fight quickly became pretty intense, so in the heat of battle they both began tearing huge chunks of rock out of the ground to throw at each other, and the valley is what remained of the landscape when they were done. Now, again, I've got no idea if all or even any of those details are correct, and truth be told, there's more than one rock formation in the West Country that claims to be the result of satanic shot putting, but I like the story. Besides which, when you look at the valley, the story makes a strange kind of sense. Between the formations of startling white rock that line the horizon and the misshapen indents that surround them, you can imagine it being the messy product of an ethereal smackdown. Awestruck is a word that I could easily overuse when describing the scenery that surrounds the path, but nowhere is it more appropriate than when describing the Valley of the Rocks. After the turmoil of the valley, the scenery settled into a quilted patchwork of pastoral fields that were intersected by criss-cross lines of hedgerows. In many ways it felt like a version of Tolkien's Shire, and coincidentally it led me into a forest path bordered with small elven waterfalls spewing crystal clear water onto smooth flat rocks. I refilled my water bottles here and was surprised by the freshness of the water. Usually the water I picked up on the trail had a conspicuous chemical tang from my water filter, but here the tang was a mere suggestion behind a pristine frigidity. I was glad for it as well. The day had started hot and only gotten hotter as it went on. Furthermore, the heat was accompanied by that sort of oppressive muggy closeness that typifies periods of high humidity in the southwest, which, as any hiker will tell you, isn't really the kind of weather you want while you're doing a lot of climbing, especially when those climbs are as steep as those surrounding Heddons Mouth. Calling Heddons Mouth a valley is a little like calling Ben Nevis a hill. It's more like a chasm, a V-shaped excision of the Earth's crust lined with a dishonestly pleasant array of trees and precariously thin paths. Climbing up or down these pathways has more in common with tightrope walking than it does with hiking. To successfully navigate them, you need to line your feet up heel to toe and keep your centre of gravity as low as possible, lest you go barrelling head first over the side. As you follow these paths downwards, it feels a little like you're descending into a lost world complete with dinosaurs, man-eating plants, and steampunk-inspired Victorian explorers. It's an impression that remains unchallenged by the harsh stone beach at its mouth or the deciduous canopy that envelops the soft valley floor in a permanent sun-dappled twilight. If it weren't for the intermittent signage and the occasional wooden bridge spanning the stream running along its backbone, you could be forgiven for believing you'd stepped through an unforeseen portal into a forgotten world. All in all, it's a landscape that makes you reconsider the meaning of the term Mother Nature. I've always disliked that name for the natural world, as it invites us to view nature as a coddling, nurturing womb, when in fact nothing could be further from the truth. Nature isn't a nanny or a caregiver, it's a crucible of the divine feminine. Mother Nature is a tiger mom. She doesn't provide you with an easy path, she creates a journey laden with obstacles, ensuring that each time you overcome one, your confidence swells, reinforced by an unassailable example of objective achievement. It was during the ascent from the valley floor that I found myself in need of such an example, and as always, the trail provided. Many cultures around the world have used combinations of heat, exhaustion and pain to bring about altered states of consciousness, and I think that we hikers often end up putting ourselves in this condition entirely by accident. Between the unrelenting sun, stifling heat and the sapping weariness of the climb out of Heddons Moor, I found myself there but not all there, sort of suspended in a world of my own, encapsulated by a thin perceptual fog. It's not the first time that it's happened. I'll often find myself in this sort of state during an especially long or challenging hike, especially if the weather's uncooperative. And while I'm there, conversations come to me. I'll find myself immersed in an internalized debate about current affairs, an imaginary conversation with a loved one, or an intimate heart-to-heart with my own inner beliefs. It's one of the things that makes my time on the trail the closest thing I've ever had to a spiritual experience. Sometimes, though, my inner critic will raise its voice and interject itself. Like all inner critics, it's a persistent little shit, and it lives in some dark mental cave I haven't yet been able to ferret the little fucker out of. Everyone has one, I think. That little voice in the back of your head that's always handy with a criticism or a put-down. The one that sneers, belittles and judges, who reminds you of mistakes that you thought were long forgotten and takes unbridled glee at litigating your own self-prosecution. Mine is an amalgam of the bullying voices from my youth, the false friends, the cruel sneering comics and the self-serving fault-finders that my adolescent self lacked the tools to either confront or endure. I can go days, sometimes weeks without hearing it, but halfway up the ascent the critic was on fine form. It's never been direct, it's more subtle than that. It's never so brash as to say, we know exactly who you are and there's not a chance in hell you're going to finish this. Instead it just asks, remember when? And then bombards me with evidentiary confirmation of my worst fears, failures, mistakes and shortcomings. Then it leaves one malignant question floating unsaid, accompanied by a dismissive shake of the head and a subtle mocking smile. What do you expect us to say? The critic followed me up the incline, right up towards the thick blankets of pinky-purple heathland that would eventually lead me to Great Hangman. It hung around for a bit, changing tactics every now and then, switching from sneering self-doubt to mind-bombing intimate details of past mistakes and personal shortcomings. In fact, it had an absolute whale of a time when I took the wrong turn at a waymarker. For some reason, a blatantly middle-class couple felt that the best use for trail signage was as a prop for a cute family photo, and had propped their twin toddlers atop each of them. I waited patiently and asked to see the sign, but clearly Instagram was more important, so I made my best guess and ended up walking a mile off route before realising my error. Of course, to the inner critic, this wasn't just an isolated and pretty meagre mistake. It was part of a much larger pattern of exasperating ineptitude that cemented my status as both worthless and incompetent. It eventually subsided, of course. It always does, especially when I have the crucible's proof to throw in its face, when I've persevered despite the hardships or challenges of the journey. Often that's just enough to take its power away and put it back into whatever mental crevice it inhabits. Nevertheless, I think that day the river definitely helped. Just before the ascent to Great Hangman proper, there's a sharp descent to a fast-flowing riverbed, where I was able to refill my bottles and soak my feet while chewing on my last remaining snack of the day. Sometimes a sit-down and a cold drink are enough to reset your mental state and cease whatever cycle you found yourself in, so that river was a godsend. I could easily have stayed there for hours, but as there was nowhere close to pitch my tent, and as it was already creeping into late afternoon, I knew I needed to get the ascent up to Great Hangman done and get into Coombe Martin before my campsite closed for the evening. At 1,043 feet, or 318 metres, Great Hangman is the highest point of the southwest coast path, and, as with most places in the West Country, there's a story behind its name. In fact, there's two. The first states that being high up and relatively imposing, it was formerly used as a place of execution. The other states that a man was blown over the side of the cliff while walking his dog, and having got the dog's lead wrapped around his neck, was strangled as the pet tried to pull him back up. Strangely though, despite it being the highest point on the path, the ascent itself wasn't too punishing. Rather than being particularly steep, instead it's long and meandering. You don't really feel like you're climbing all that often, but it can feel utterly unrelenting. Plus there's the bloody rocks. The paths across Exmoor are notoriously rocky. They're absolutely strewn with them. Small, medium and large, all sharp and jagged and loose, and however carefully you try to pick your way through them, you're either sliding on one, stubbing your boot on another, or perching on top of the next. Like I said, Mother Nature is a tiger mom, and she's endlessly inventive with her obstacles. Eventually the crest at the top of the hill came into view, and not long after that the great cairn that marks its summit made an appearance. I don't know how long hikers had been adding their own stones to it, but when I arrived it was easily the width of a small family car. So, after taking a moment to appreciate the views and adding my own contribution, I walked on by and continued on towards Coombe Martin. However, before I could get to the town I had to contend with Little Hangman. Unlike Great Hangman, this isn't a particularly big hill or a particularly challenging climb, but it was the last climb of a particularly challenging day, and to be honest, after completing its bigger brother it felt a tiny bit superfluous. In many ways it was a little like being forced to eat a rich tea biscuit after you'd just finished a slice of cheesecake. Nice enough, but hardly the highlight. Next though came the descent into Coombe Martin proper. Like most of the little seaside villages in this part of the world, it's at the bottom of a very steep, very narrow valley. Not Heddons mouth steep, but steep enough to be a knee killer. So I stuck my head down, put the imaginary blinkers on and set to it. I'd like to describe it in more detail, but to be perfectly frank, the only things I could think about during that descent were hot food and a cold drink. In fact, I was so busy obsessing about my stomach that I pretty much ignored the scenery of Coombe Martin, which I have to say is a damn shame because it's an utterly gorgeous place. Luckily though, my campsite wasn't too far out of town and the night warden was good enough to give me a lift up to my pitch in his golf cart, so I was still semi-compos mentis by the time I arrived. Mind you, at one point I did find myself trying to use my tent's rainfly as a ground sheet, so I think counting to 10 might have proven a challenge. There were some nights during this journey where I was able to sit up and enjoy the sunset or hang out and socialise with other campers, but tonight it was all I could do to pitch up and then collapse on my sleeping mat. I was utterly done in, but also satisfied from a long day on trail and more than a little proud of myself, so I slipped into a well-earned sleep and awaited the next day.